All right, well, good afternoon or good evening. Indeed, even good morning, depending on where you're joining us in the world. It's a delight to welcome you to the Center for Global Law and Governance's second roundtable of the academic semester and year entitled Banning Space Weapons. And I am one of the CGLG directors, Dr. Adam Bauer, and with my colleague, Dr. Matea Peter, we are really delighted to welcome all of you joining us from St. Andrews in the United Kingdom and indeed elsewhere in the world. This is, I think, a really interesting and important time to be having this conversation, and we're really looking forward to the conversation that will come over the next hour and a half. So by way of a little bit of context, I think anyone joining this call is already aware that space is in the news a lot these days. And many of you will be aware, for example, over the summer of the commercial space tourism events that took place with Virgin, Blue Origin, and SpaceX. And you'll also probably be aware that there's a great deal of other forms of commercialization of space already taking place, and the expansion of spacefaring actors, both states and non-state actors of various kinds. But I think many of us are also aware that amidst all of this excitement and these growing opportunities, there is increasing competition. And that includes military activities that could indeed threaten the continued safety, sustainability, and use of orbital space. And that includes the subject of this roundtable, the testing of anti-satellite weapon systems and specifically kinetic anti-satellite systems. In 2019, India conducted a test of one of these systems. The United States did so in 2008, and China did in 2007. And while those three tests have varied in different ways, they all contributed in their own way to the growth of debris in orbit. And indeed, the growth of space debris or space junk is a major problem for the continued use and governance and operations of low Earth orbit and the Earth orbits more broadly. And addressing this challenge is critical, given how important satellite-based systems have become to our daily lives. And so with that in mind, I'm delighted to be able to welcome three experts to discuss this particular topic over the next hour and a half, and to do so in a context in which we'll be able to explore both the particular issues surrounding kinetic anti-satellite testing, but also perhaps the broader military, strategic, legal, and political issues that are going to be of great concern to all of us and indeed to all space-faring actors. Before I introduce our three speakers and before we get into the conversation, let me just then briefly highlight a couple of housekeeping logistics issues. The first of these is that this event is being recorded and will be available on the Center for Global Law and Governance website in the coming days. Now, visually, you'll notice that as we go through this conversation, only one speaker is visible to you at any point in time, but we are treating this very much as a dialogue, as a conversation among the panelists and indeed the audience out there. And so we really encourage you to pose questions. We will be attempting to integrate those questions into the discussion throughout the hour and a half, rather than simply having a Q&A session at the end. And so if you have questions at any point, please use the Q&A function that is in the toolbar of your video viewing screen. You'll be able to see a little sort of circular comment bubble with a question mark in it. You can type your questions into that, and I'm going to do my best to integrate as many questions as I can, as appropriate, as we move through the conversation. Now, we're going to begin in a moment with opening remarks from each of our panelists before turning to an initial round of questions for each of them. Then we're going to broaden out the discussion to engage with a variety of other issues that I have in mind, that our panelists want to address, and indeed things that you, the audience, want to discuss. But before we do that, I want to also briefly mention that many of you on this call will be familiar already with the Outer Space Institute and the open letter that they have recently published calling for negotiations over a global ban on kinetic anti-satellite testing. I'd encourage all of you to go to the Outer Space Institute website, take a look at the letter, and if you feel so inclined, to add your name to the growing list of signatures from academics, former diplomats, people in the space industry, and indeed students and members of the public at large. So now it's my pleasure to introduce our three panelists before turning over to them for the conversation to come. In alphabetical order, the first of our speakers today is Professor Michael Byers, who is the Canada Research Chair in Global Politics and International Law and the co-director of the Outer Space Institute at the University of British Columbia, my alma mater, so it's always great to be able to engage with UBC. Among other initiatives, Michael was one of the lead authors on the OSI open letter on kinetic anti-satellite testing, which provides the basis for the roundtable in our discussion today. Michael is a prolific author in the areas of international law and global politics, and much of his current research focuses on Arctic and increasingly outer space law and governance. He is currently completing a book with Professor Aaron Boley entitled Who Owns Outer Space? Astrophysics, International Law, and New Space, which is under contract with Cambridge University Press, and I'm very much looking forward to seeing that when it comes out, so no pressure, Michael and Aaron. And we're really delighted because during this academic year, Michael is a St. Andrews Senior Global Fellow hosted by the CGLG and the School of International Relations. And in that capacity, he will be engaging in online events, but especially an in-person visit to St. Andrews in the spring of 2022. And we'll announce more initiatives related to that closer to the time. So Michael, welcome. We're delighted to have you. Our next speaker, Victoria Sampson, is the Washington Office Director of the Secure World Foundation. And again, many of you on this call will be familiar with Victoria because she is an internationally recognized expert on military, space, and security issues, and a prolific author of op-eds, analytical pieces, journal articles, and updates on missile defense and space security issues. And among other things, Victoria is the co-editor with Brian Whedon of the annual Global Counterspace Capabilities Report published by the Secure World Foundation. And for those of you in the audience that maybe aren't as familiar with space security issues, let me take a moment just to plug this because the Global Counterspace Capabilities Report is a phenomenal resource of open source information on what's going on in military space and particularly in counterspace research and activities. And speaking as someone who got into this field relatively recently, I've found it to be an incredible resource. And so it's a delight to have Victoria joining us as well. And last, but certainly not least, Sarah Thiele, I'm sorry, Sarah, my apologies, is a fourth-year undergraduate student at UBC studying for a Bachelor of Science with combined honors in physics and astronomy. She's a junior fellow of the Outer Space Institute and previous intern at the Institute for Research on Exoplanets. And as part of her research with the OSI, Sarah conducted the calculations on debris generation from kinetic anti-satellite weapons that form the scientific basis for the OSI's open letter. And so, Sarah, it's a real delight to have you as well, with apologies for, as anticipated, making a mistake on your last name. I won't do it again. So with all of that in mind, it's a real delight to welcome all three of our speakers and to engage in what I think is going to be a really productive and interesting conversation. So with that in mind, Victoria, I'm going to throw over to you first to set the stage in terms of what we know about global counterspace capabilities before we turn to the legal and the scientific dimensions of the open letter as a response.
Well, everyone, thank you, Adam, and the CGLC for inviting me to participate in this event. As said, my name is Victoria Sampson. I'm the Washington Office Director of the Secure World Foundation. We're a private organization that focuses on the long-term sustainable use of outer space. All right, so going ahead, the space domain is undergoing a serious, significant set of changes. A growing number of countries and commercial actors are getting involved in space, resulting in more innovation and benefits on Earth, but also more congestion and competition in space. From a security perspective, an increasing number of countries are looking to use space to enhance their military capabilities and national security. And if anyone's shown my presentation, second slide, please. If not, no worries. The existence of counterspace capabilities is not new, but the circumstances surrounding them are. Today, there are increased incentives for development and potential use of offensive counterspace capabilities. There are also greater potential consequences from their widespread use that could have global repercussions well beyond the military, as huge parts of the global economy and society are reliant on space applications. Right now, we are seeing an upward trend in the proliferation of counterspace capabilities. As more countries incorporate space capabilities to their national infrastructure and use it to enhance their military capabilities and national security. This has also led to more countries looking at developing their own counterspace capabilities that could be used to deceive, disrupt, deny, degrade, or destroy space systems. And there are global repercussions from that well beyond the military sphere. As was mentioned earlier, in Adam's gracious introduction, Secure World produces its annual open source report, Global Counterspace Capabilities and Assessment, which analyzes counterspace capabilities being developed by multiple countries across 5 different categories: direct descent, co-orbital, electronic warfare, directed energy, and cyber. Direct descent weapons are those that use ground, air, or sea launch missiles with interceptors to kinetically destroy satellites through force of impact, but are not placed into orbit themselves. Co-orbital weapons are those that are placed into orbit and then maneuver to approach the target to attack it by various means, including destructive and non-destructive. Directed energy weapons use focus energy, such as laser, particle, or microwave beams, to interfere or destroy space systems. Electronic warfare weapons use radio frequency energy to interfere with or jam the communications to or from satellites. Finally, cyber weapons use software and network techniques to compromise, control, interfere, or destroy computer systems. To generalize on the current state of development globally, while there's significant research and development on a broad range of destructive and non-destructive counterspace capabilities, only non-destructive capabilities actively being used in current military conflicts. I will point out that our product is available on our website for free. We have the whole thing in English, and the executive summary is in French, Spanish, Russian, and Mandarin. And if you can change the PowerPoint slide to the third one. But if not, no worries. All right, so another part of this proliferation can be seen as an uptick in ASAT tests. Since 2005, there have been more than 20 tests of anti-satellite weapon systems in space by 4 different countries. A rate of testing that's not happened since the 1960s. So again, pointing out that, counterspace capabilities have been pretty much a factor since space, since humans have started going into space. But there was a downtick for a few decades, and it's really picked up over the past few years. Another concerning development is that some satellites have been observed to make deliberately close approaches to the satellites of other countries without coordination, prior knowledge, or consent to operators of the satellites. There is growing concern that such behaviors may increase tensions between countries or could be misinterpreted as a hostile action that precipitates an armed attack. We're also seeing an increase in the number of countries building up military space organizations as part of their interest in protecting their space assets. Russia and China both have military space organizations. In 2019 alone, there was a creation of military space organizations by the United States, France, Japan, and India, although it should be noted that several of those built on existing military infrastructure. In the past year, we have seen Australia, Germany, and the United Kingdom launch their own versions of this as well. While the existence of a military space organization does not automatically translate to an offensive counterspace capability or interest, it does indicate that the host countries are evolving their use of counterspace capability and at least open to considering some sort of it. Because a lot of the times the reason given for at least partially explaining why they need this is that there are threats to their own space capabilities and responses needed. Finally, one last trend I'll point out before I turn over to my fellow panelists, there is the development and expansion of space situational awareness, or SSA, capacities, both at the national and the commercial level. Reliable and accurate SSA is very important in verifying actions on orbit. While SSA is not uniquely used for counterspace, it is a critical enabler for both offensive and defensive counterspace capabilities. And as we go into later on today, we'll talk about this more, but it is very important in verifying agreements or guardrails to irresponsible behavior, or depending on one's perspective, to be able to identify when unusual or threatening behavior on orbit is happening. With that, I'll stop and thank you. Wait to hear fellow panelists.
Thank you so much for that initial intervention. Michael, I'm going to throw over to you now in just a second, because obviously we're interested in these military issues, but we're also speaking about this today because this is a concern. There are things that are concerning, both threatening, but also worrying in terms of the sustainability of the space region. And that's, as I take it, why the Outer Space Institute became interested in this issue. So could you maybe give us a bit of a sense of what the OSI's mandate is on this issue, and particularly give us an introduction to the open letter?
Well, thank you, and thank you to everyone who's with us today or watching later. The Outer Space Institute is a global network of experts working on major challenges in near-Earth space and working together across disciplines. This is, I think, the unique feature. We're pairing astrophysicists and engineers with social scientists and international lawyers, retired diplomats, retired United Nations officials to try to spot the next big issue and come up with workable solutions. And the International Open Letter on Kinetic ASAT testing is advancing what we believe is a workable solution to one small element of space security, but something that is of almost crisis proportions right now. And that's because of the dramatic increase in the number of satellites in low Earth orbit, particularly as a result of the appearance of mega constellations. SpaceX with Starlink, which already accounts for roughly 1/3 of the operational satellites in low Earth orbit. There's OneWeb, there's Amazon, there's a Chinese state-owned company that is planning a constellation of many thousands of satellites. And so it's conceivable that within the next decade, we will go from roughly 6,000 satellites today to over 100,000 satellites. And we've known since 1978, thanks to a NASA scientist named Donald Kessler, that not only is there a collision risk when you have so many objects in orbit, but every collision increases dramatically the chances of further collisions, because when you fragment a satellite, you dramatically increase the surface area of the material. And therefore, from a scientific point of view, you are putting yourself at risk of more collisions and potentially the loss of entire orbital shells of access to low Earth orbit for all the civilian and military purposes that we make of that region today. And Victoria's painted the picture about anti-satellite weapons. Our particular concern is with those that involve violent impacts, kinetic weapons tests, because they're the ones that create debris. And we're looking at this as low-hanging fruit, as something that's achievable. And I guess my explanation here begins with a bit of a history of international space law. The first space law treaty dates to 1963, and it's the Limited Test Ban Treaty. And the Limited Test Ban Treaty bans the testing of nuclear weapons in space. And it was negotiated very quickly as a result of a test conducted by the United States. The United States exploded a nuclear device 400 kilometers above the Pacific Ocean to test its capabilities as an anti-satellite weapon. And it worked much better than they expected. They disabled 6 satellites, including 3 of their own operational satellites, including the first commercial satellite to be beaming live television signals across the Atlantic Ocean. They wiped them out, and they went, hang on a second, this is not good. We're increasingly reliant on low Earth orbit for all of these military services like surveillance and communications and basically looking at each other's nuclear facilities on the ground. We can't lose low Earth orbit. And the United States, the Soviet Union, the United Kingdom and France came together and negotiated the first space treaty. They banned the use of nuclear weapons in space for test purposes. And we're proposing something similar today. And we're doing this partly because militaries have an equally strong interest today in preserving access to low Earth orbit, because they're so dependent on low Earth orbit for communications and targeting and surveillance. And so the letter just proposes to deal with this low-hanging fruit. And the letter, and we'll get to this later, I'm sure, comes forward at a time that the British delegation to the United Nations General Assembly is pursuing a diplomatic initiative that will hopefully in the next few weeks result in the creation of an open-ended working group to deal with the larger issue of space threats, of space security. And we're hopeful that our international open letter will add a little bit of public support from the global community to that British effort to encourage all of the member states of the United Nations General Assembly First Committee to get behind the latest British resolution and to move this forward diplomatically. We don't want to tell the diplomats how to do their job. We just want to express the widest possible support for that effort. I'm going to stop there because the heart of the International Open Letter is a scientific plot, and Sarah is far more capable of explaining that plot to the audience than I am.
Yes, Sarah, that's a perfect lead-in from Michael, because one of the things I think that he mentioned in his remarks is that what the OSI is doing is bringing together scientists, those working in natural sciences and astrophysics and others, with those of us like myself, like Michael, Victoria, that are primarily trained in the humanities, the social sciences. But at the core of the letter is this fascinating plot. And since many people on the call may not have yet had a chance to read the letter and see it, I'd love it if you could introduce that and speak a little bit to what it's showing us. And then I think through the rest of the conversation, one of the things we'll be exploring is sort of the implications of that plot. So I'm going to throw over to you now.
Okay, wonderful. So yeah, my goal over the next few minutes is just to set the stage here for the scientific basis for kinetic anti-satellite tests and get everyone on this call to have a solid understanding of this plot that you see in front of you. So to give you an idea of what exactly an anti-satellite test is, you have a weapon of some sort, like a missile, kill satellite, or an equivalent, which is used to physically destroy another satellite. So in theory, any space asset, even a communication satellite, could become an ASAT weapon if it's used to physically destroy another object. But to give you guys a solid example here, I'll dive into the India ASAT test that was done in 2019, which is also modeled here in this plot. So the purpose of this graph that was put in the letter is to really give context to what the consequences might be if a test such like that one that was done in 2019 would be that if it occurred in a present day orbital environment with all of these satellite mega constellations, the types of consequences that might occur. So during the test itself, just to set the stage for what something like this might look like, you have a missile which is launched at a already existing satellite which is already in orbit. And so there's an initial boost phase when thrust is provided by burning fuel. After the fuel is used up, the missile follows a ballistic trajectory where its path is only being affected by gravity. So it follows a curved arc of sorts. So think of it like when you're lobbing a baseball to someone far away, you throw it at a high initial angle, so it arcs away from you. The missile is only guided for brief periods of time, most of it's unpowered. So all this is happening over a very short period of time. So from launch until collision with the satellite is under about 3 minutes in the case of the India ASAT test. So during its flight, the first two stages fall away, and the third stage of the rocket is a kill vehicle, which has some sort of a navigation guidance system on board, which it uses to home in on the target, the satellite, and it collides with it. This is what's called a hit-to-kill test. So in this case, there weren't any explosives that went off. The kill vehicle just slams into the satellite, completely fracturing it in what is deemed a catastrophic collision. So the whole thing breaks up. So other anti-satellite tests might use other types of infrastructure in order to actually hit the target itself, which such as setting off an explosive device. But in the case of the India ASAT test, it was just basically a kinetic kill vehicle just slamming into it. So even though there's no explosive used, the amount of energy that's imparted into the target is still massive. So I believe one of the cited studies told a imparted energy of about 130 million joules of energy, which is about 30 kilograms of TNT going off. And that's at the smaller end of what these types of collisions might look like. The relative speeds between the two objects is massive. It's about 10 kilometers per second. And the satellite that you're hitting is weighing up to like 1,000 kilograms, and now you've just exploded that into a lot of pieces. When you inject all the energy into the system, what you're essentially doing is instantaneously adding a small velocity change to each fragment. So that's what scientists call a delta V. And how big the delta V is for each fragment is a non-trivial calculation. But what's an important outcome of this is that the orbital trajectory of all of the fragments has now changed so that it deviates from that which it was just on. So the satellite was on orbit, which was pretty close to circular. So meaning it stays about the same distance from Earth all the time as it goes around the planet. And the speed at which it's traveling keeps it in this perfect orbit in a circular orbit around the Earth. And it's not being propelled by an engine or anything. It's basically just continuously following fast enough that it just keeps missing the Earth. So gravity is keeping it bound. So now you've changed that magical velocity that is keeping the satellite bound in the circular orbit. And so all of the orbital trajectories of the fragments will change from being circular around the planet to now they are ellipses. So they will go further away from the Earth sometimes, and they'll go closer to the Earth sometimes as they go around. This is called an eccentric orbit. The eccentricity is what characterizes the difference between the highest and lowest altitude a fragment will reach throughout its orbit. And if the energy that's imparted is really big and at the right angle, you can send fragments into very high eccentricity orbits that reach altitudes much higher than the altitude at which the test was conducted. So this is the point at which we can turn to this plot. So the first thing we see is these gray lines, and all of these show the orbital paths of debris fragments from the India ASAT test. So these are modeled using actual data of the debris fragments. So when they were identified and tracked by the identification system that was looking for all these fragments, and it was tied to the event, they have their point in time is noted, and you can basically extract their orbital data from this and create what at that moment their orbital paths would look like. So you can follow what their orbital paths would be by following these gray lines. You can see they get to high altitudes and they get to low altitudes as they go around the Earth. So as you go across the plot from left to right, you're seeing the altitude change of each fragment. And you can see that there's a lot of variation now, and even though the test was taking place at a very low orbit, about 280 kilometers at an altitude above the Earth, you have fragments reaching 2,000 kilometers higher than this during their new orbits due to that extra bit of energy that they received. And the second important component of this plot is those multicolored lines that you see. So each of these horizontal lines represent the altitudes of various shells of these satellite megaconstellations that Michael mentioned. So these designated altitudes will be occupied by thousands of satellites. And also of note is the black dots and red triangles here across the bottom there at about 400 kilometers, which shows the altitude at which the International Space Station and China's Tiangong Space Station reside. And those are both very large, expensive, important space infrastructures, which also holds human crew members and astronauts as well. So as you can see, the debris fragments cover basically the entire altitude range of low Earth orbit. And so every time it goes around the Earth once, a debris fragment will cross basically all of those shells, every single megaconstellation shell and the altitude of the space station twice per orbit as it goes around, especially those high eccentricity ones. So look at this broad scope here. Basically, we plotted historical data, so something that happened 2 years ago when the low Earth orbit environment was very different. You didn't have these like thousands and thousands of satellites. But if you had a test like that occur in an environment that has all of these shells, like you see on this plot here, the consequences might be very different. Looking at, collisional risks between satellites and debris fragments, that risk and probability estimations is going to look a lot different. And rather than having, risk assessed on a satellite per satellite basis, so like one fragment with a single satellite, it's really important to start looking at it from a cumulative perspective. So aggregating over the entire satellite shell, what's the probability that something's going to get hit? And I think it might be a lot more significant now in more of a new space environment. And so I just want to set the stage with that. I think that about covers it. So thanks for listening, and I will pass it back to Adam now to continue us on our way.
Thanks very much, Sarah. It's no small feat to be able to compress all of that information into a way that is understandable even to non-scientific minds like myself. So I'm really grateful for that. And it's, I think, really a valuable part of the open letter and the entire initiative to try to bring that aspect to the discussion so we can really visualize what we're speaking of and why this is such a concern. So maybe as a sort of second round of question, I wanted to maybe come back and hit again on this sort of theme of why now. And all three of our panelists have done, I think, a very nice job of highlighting why this issue is of concern. And I wanted just maybe to sharpen those discussions even just a little bit further. So Victoria, I'm going to come to you first and then to Michael on the sort of the policy and law side of things, or even just the initiative itself. And maybe just ask if you can elaborate a little bit further on, you mentioned a variety of different types of counter space capabilities, and we're focusing primarily on these kinetic ones. And maybe you could just give a little bit more detail on some of the most worrying examples and trends on the kinetic anti-satellite side. And then Michael, after that, I'll come to you and just ask why focus on this particular issue right now before we dive into a little bit more of the science as well. So Victoria, what do you see as the kind of the primary concerns or the trends in this kinetic anti-satellite sphere, if you like, that we should be most attentive to? Sure.
I mean, as I said in my presentation, counter space capabilities have been developed pretty much from the beginning of the space age. So this isn't necessarily new. And even a kinetic energy anti-satellite weapon has been part of, it was part of the US, our counter space capabilities. It's been part of, it was researched a little bit in the Soviet Union time. And now we're looking at kind of a revamping sort of thing of this. I mean, a kinetic energy anti-satellite interceptor, a lot of times they're tied pretty closely to countries' missile defense programs. because a lot of times it's using a lot of the same interceptors, just the targeting and that sort of thing that changes. But, for example, I will point out that the Chinese 2007 anti-satellite test was the same interceptor that they then used a couple years later for their missile defense test, except at that point they called it a missile defense test and their target was a ballistic missile. So, hey, no problem here, except they're developing an anti-satellite capability, that could be used later. In 2008, the United States shot down one of our own satellites because in theory it was going to be a danger. I've always said it was a response to the 2007 Chinese anti-satellite test. But be that as it may, the United States used the Navy Missile Defense Interceptor and basically just changed the software, a little bit. It wasn't a big change. And so again, it was ably done. And then going back to Sarah's point about how pieces can be kicked up higher, debris from the force of impact, we did see that modeled in the 2008 U.S. Anti-satellite test, Burnt Frost, where pieces of the debris went up a lot higher than the actual intercept altitude. And, just to grossly oversimplify it, the higher up you go, the longer things stick around. And so the concern is once you get to, there's a certain altitude where eventually the Earth's gravity will pull down debris and, self-clear, so to speak. But once you get beyond that point, things can be around for decades, if not centuries, or just forever. And so that's a real concern as well. And then finally, I will point out, when India did its test in 2019, a lot of the statements from the Indian government said, we did this in a responsible manner. We did this at a low altitude. We try to aim it so the point of impact is going down, and the debris is all going to be gone in 45 days. I mean, it's an imperfect world, right? The degree of impact was not quite as low as they said. In fact, the same thing happened for them that happened for the United States in 2008. It's in pieces of debris that were kicked up to about 1,000 kilometers, which meant they're going to be around for a while. The debris did not go away within 45 days. I think it took over a year. So, I mean, just that sort of thing. And so the concern that I have, one of the reasons why I'm a signatory of this letter, is that I'm worried that if we're seeing a way, well, it's okay to do a kinetic energy anti-satellite test as long as you do it in a quote responsible manner. I mean, at some point, you're going to get to where it's going to inadvertently escalate things, or you're going to make it seem like it's okay to do it. And so everyone's going to be doing it, who wants to be perceived as a major space power, and you have pieces of debris being kicked up, in spite of your best thoughts or best attempts. So it can really, change how the domain is actually being done in a way that can be escalatory or causing debris at altitudes that could be around for quite some time. So with that, I'll stop there.
Thanks, Victoria. That's fantastic. Michael, I'll come to you maybe on a sort of related question. If there's anything you wanted to add on to what Victoria said, please go ahead. But I suppose that sort of the follow-on that I had in my mind was there's obviously, I think the letter does a very nice job of initiating or sort of acknowledging and really articulating this concern. And I suppose one of the questions that a skeptic might have is, well, why focus narrowly on this? There's a lot of problems in space, to say nothing of other areas. And so maybe you could just flesh out a little bit more how you see the kinetic test ban proposal as maybe relating. We don't have to go into all the details of all the various diplomatic initiatives. We may get to those, I think, a little bit later on, but how you see this contributing in that broader set of responses to what are a variety of problems.
Well, thank you. And I will mention a couple of things before I respond to your question. The first is, and this is really important, we believe that India engaged in a good faith effort to avoid creating long-lasting space debris. I don't think India intended to create long-lasting space debris or to put the International Space Station at risk, but they did. And this actually goes to the point that it's impossible to engage in a kinetic ASAT test with a violent impact and not create long-lasting debris because of the sheer amount of energy involved, which will kick some pieces of debris into highly eccentric orbits. And even if, as India did, you try to strike the satellite with the missile on a downward trajectory, Sarah's got an interesting video, which she can show in a few minutes, that shows that you're still going to kick some debris into highly elliptical orbits. So all of these efforts don't actually work in terms of preventing long-lasting debris. What worked in favor of India was that the orbital environment was not that busy, at least as compared to today or 5 or 10 years in the future. And this is the point. is that with the construction of these mega constellations, we are going to see such a dramatic increase in the number of objects in low Earth orbit that the risk of collisions will go up exponentially. And if you have a test like the India test in this new environment, it will be grossly irresponsible. And it could actually contribute to the Kessler syndrome and result in the loss of access to orbital shells and potentially all of low Earth orbit. Now, this then turns to your question, Adam. There are an awful lot of actors on this planet who have very strong interests in maintaining safe and sustainable access to low Earth orbit. The number of applications, both civilian and military, is growing at a phenomenal rate. So whether it's food production, or whether it's climate science, or whether it's global communications, or whether it's military surveillance, targeting, the operating of armed drones, modern military is intensely dependent on low Earth orbit. When you add it all up, the international community has a huge stake in this. And the construction of these mega constellations means that a single kinetic ASAT test in this new environment could badly damage everyone's interests. And that creates the opportune moment for collective decision-making and restraint. And I think we're seeing that. We're seeing that with the British initiative in the United Nations General Assembly. We're seeing that with the response to the request from the Secretary General for views from states on that British initiative, in which not a single state asserted a right or an appropriateness to engage in kinetic ASAT testing today. I think we're seeing here an alignment of interest and leadership from the British delegation at the United Nations General Assembly that creates this opportune moment. Now, they may go further. They may try to negotiate some sort of agreement that deals with space weaponization more generally, or they might take the low-hanging fruit of kinetic ASAT testing. Again, I'm not trying to tell the diplomats how to do their job, but the point of the International Open Letter is to engage in a kind of public diplomacy, to raise global awareness about this issue, about the crisis that we face, and to identify that there is one small solution to a particular problem, and it's available now. And so everyone who signs this International Open Letter is going to read this. They're going to study the plot. They're going to understand the situation. They're going to tell their friends and colleagues. It's going to spread. This awareness will become something that's taken on by the global media, and we'll get a swell, hopefully, of public opinion, just like we had with regards to anti-personnel landmines back in the 1990s that resulted in a ban on the use of anti-personnel landmines. And as Adam well knows, because he wrote the book on this, even the powerful military states that did not ratify that treaty, the United States, China, Russia, have dramatically reduced their use of those weapons as a result of the changing of what is considered acceptable by the global community. There's been a change in the normative environment on that issue, and we want to change the normative environment with regards to kinetic ASAT testing.
Michael, thanks very much indeed. I mean, I appreciate the book plug. I mean, the book is available still from disreputable booksellers everywhere. But I do appreciate that follow-up. I see that Victoria has a quick follow-up, and then I'll come to you, Sarah, in just a moment. So Victoria, why don't you follow on right now? Go ahead.
All right, thank you. Yeah, I mean, I just want to emphasize as well, when we're talking debris, I mean, not all debris is created equal, right? One of the things my organization just put out last week was a graphic looking at space sustainability. We have a little bit on debris on that, but just pointing out, you know, there's different sizes that we can track. There's maybe 34,000 pieces of debris that we can track that's greater than 10 centimeters in diameter, and those are pretty deadly. There's maybe 900,000, we're guessing, between 1 and 10 centimeters, and those can be dangerous. And then maybe millions, 128 million between 1 millimeter and 1 centimeter. Those are pretty small, but those could cause some damage as well. And so that's concern. Again, going back to a reason why there is an interest in this sort of kinetic energy ASAT test ban, is that it doesn't have to be a large piece of debris to be dangerous. And frankly, we can track some debris, but not all of it. And so the concern that I have is that if we get this acceptance, as Michael brought up about, anti-satellite tests, as long as they're done safely. There's an assumption that we have 100% situational awareness, can see everything, and we can track everything. We'll know when satellites or human beings up in space stations are in danger, and we just frankly don't have that level of clarity, and so that's why it's a danger. Thank you.
Victoria, thanks so much. Sarah, I'm going to come to you actually with two things, because the first is what I had in mind. Michael did a super job of setting you up for a question I think is received often, because as Michael points out, the way that the Indian government presented the 2019 test was that they had made an effort to be responsible, to minimize debris by targeting a satellite in a very low altitude. And of course, the concerns Victoria rightly raises notwithstanding, that was something that I think maybe did get some traction in the international community. If you compare the relatively modest amount of complaint that the Indian test received as compared with earlier kinetic tests. There were still complaints, but they were not on the same scale, I think it's fair to say. No, I know that you've looked into this a little bit, so maybe I could ask you just to sort of respond. There was this idea that the way in which that 2019 test was conducted at a low altitude, and as you pointed out, with a downward, in an intended downward trajectory of the kill vehicle, was somehow a safe-ish or safe enough way of conducting a kinetic test. Maybe you could just sort of elaborate on that that issue, and then maybe if I can also ask when you're done that, we have a question that from an anonymous commenter, and I think Victoria touched on this already in terms of absolute numbers of what we think is up there in terms of debris. But in terms of the Indian test, do we have a sense of the size of debris that was generated and over what time scales that debris is a risk, and what do we know about that aspect? So sort of maybe if you could take those two parts in sequence, that would be great. Thanks.
Yeah, for sure. Thanks for both of those. So as far as the first question regarding the downward angle, so definitely it's helpful for sure to try and minimize debris as much as possible, to keep it like at a low altitude. Having a missile collide with a satellite at a downward angle, it's one of those things where it's like you can try, to time it as best you can. It might not be exact. I know that there was some modeling that was done of the India ASAT test afterwards that suggests that it might not have been at 100%, coming at a downward angle. So there's been some speculation about that. But kind of a big takeaway when we looked into this was actually that even with all of those things taken into account, you're not going to mitigate all of the long-term debris. You're definitely going to help. But I actually have a video that might be helpful to demonstrate this. So I'm going to try and screen share. We'll see how this goes with, okay, can everyone see this? All right. Okay, so this was done in the days following the actual India ASAT test. And so in this video, you'll see the green line is the satellite, and the red curve here, hopefully you guys can see that playing, is the missile. And so as you can see on the left, there is a ton of debris that goes downwards immediately in that downward angle. But the rest of the debris, there is a ton that still ends up in orbit. So you are going to have a bunch that deorbits immediately, comes back in because you have these low altitudes, and the delta V's that are imparted into all of the fragments puts them on a downward trajectory, and they just re-enter and burn up. However, you are still going to end up with a bunch of debris that gets kicked at a certain angle or with enough energy that they're going to end up lasting longer than say 45 days, like the people who did the India ASAT test when they talked about it, and they had given that number as kind of a ballpark figure. So for kind of following up into your second question, which ties in there, let's see if I can, there we go. All right. Yeah, following up on that second part of that question, so even though you have a bunch of debris that goes in downwards and it re-enters right away, which is kind of an issue on itself because that's not taken into account in all of the cataloged debris tracking, because it just re-enters too fast to be tracked. So say after the India ASAT test, over the periods of like the next year or so, they continuously added new pieces that were connected to that event into a catalog. So there was about, say, 400 pieces of debris that were identified as like, this definitely came from this event. And they were able to get orbital elements data for it, which was used in the model for that plot. And that took about 2 years for everything to completely deorbit over time. So a lot of it does deorbit in the first few months, for example, but those last few fragments take a really long time. But that's the 400 ones that A, we have tracked, and B, that we can see. So you have these this 2-level incompleteness to your data. So the first is that there's a whole bunch that re-enters, and those might be large enough to see if they were still in orbit, but they've deorbited immediately. And secondly, you have all the pieces that are too small to see. So for every one fragment that you do see, there might be a couple hundred that you don't see because they're so small. So we did some modeling of a really similar test using the NASA standard breakup model, for example, and the way that they have size distributions for fragmentations for something like this, you're going to have an order of 10 to 100,000 pieces that are of millimeter size, millimeter up to a centimeter in size. So now you only have 400 pieces here that are tracked. You're going to have hundreds of thousands of pieces of debris that are taking upwards to up to 2 years to deorbit. And especially those the really high altitude ones, as their period over the the lifetime of their orbit, as they slowly deorbit, they're basically slowly, because of gas drag, being pulled through to lower and lower altitudes over time from these high altitudes. And so they're over time slowly evolving through all of the different satellite shells, and so they're basically a continuous risk throughout their entire lifespan. So, when you're doing calculations of collisional risk, you have to integrate over their lifetime, because the longer that they're in orbit, the longer that they're going to be a risk to everything up there. So hopefully that gives a nice overview. Let me know if there's any follow-up questions on that, though.
Thanks very much, Sarah. I think that's a great response. And actually what I wanted to do, because I know that the Indian test is one of the ones that is most recent and obviously in people's memory, but there's a variety of other things going on in orbit that may be categorized as having a kinetic component. And so we have a question that came in, again, from an anonymous audience member that says, recently a Russian satellite released a sub-satellite, which in turn, quote, fired a projectile, according to the US characterization of this, and then characterize this as a Russian anti-satellite test in orbit, as opposed to what we've been speaking of so far, which has primarily been missiles fired from the Earth. Russia says that it's only experimenting with an on-orbit servicing tool. And what do our panelists think is the correct interpretation? Maybe I'll come to Victoria first, but then Michael and Sarah, if you have anything that you wanted to add into that, please feel free to do so. So Victoria, why don't I come to you first on this mysterious satellite or mini satellite?
Yeah, and so we go into that, and again, not to keep plugging my stuff, but again, we go into this probably exhaustive detail in our counter-space threat document. But it is part of what Russia is developing in terms of their rendezvous and proximity operations or close approach type stuff. Pointing out as well that they're not the only ones that have released multiple things. The United States has done that as well. This came a couple years ago where they did do something that was expelled at quite a high volume. It was not aimed at anything, so it was just released at a high enough speed that there was some concern that it could be used as some sort of counter space capability, offensive counter space capability, but it's still really hard to say. But that is why I think there's a lot of interest right now in looking at norms of behavior and identifying what do we see as responsible and irresponsible behavior, because right now all we can do is express discomfort when countries do things that we don't like, and frankly, and I say we, the United States, other countries have discomfort with things that the United States is doing as well. And it's really hard to separate true concerns about capabilities from geopolitical rivalry. And so the idea behind having some sort of internationally agreed upon, however you want to look at it, list of responsible behavior or irresponsible behavior, it would take out some of the value judgment in terms of, whether certain countries get along, and just say, look, this was definitively a bad idea. Looking at the responses for countries for the submissions from the British resolution that Michael brought up, UNGA 75/36, pretty much everyone across the board says the idea of close approaches, non-consensual close approaches is a bad idea, because again, you don't know necessarily how they're going to be doing it, what their intent is. And again, looking at this past summer, the US Secretary of Defense Austin released a memo where he identified 5 norms of responsible behavior, and non-cooperative close approach is one of them as well. So it seems there's some sort of international consensus gelling around the idea this is a bad idea, we should not encourage it. You know, if you're going to be doing close approach, there should be some discussion between the two satellite operators or what have you. But right now, it's just kind of like, well, we hear tell of these, you know, capabilities being developed, and we're not entirely clear as to what the goal is. There's not a lot of transparency, you know, there's no real way to say this is, you know, considered to be responsible, irresponsible, just because, again, there's a lot of discussions that affect it from based on how you look at those countries. One of the things you mentioned earlier was, you know, a lot of countries criticized India for the anti-satellite tests in 2019. I would argue that's largely because India is perceived in a different manner than China is. And frankly, the only US government official that criticized the 2019 anti-satellite tests by India was a NASA administrator who was very upset because he had people up in the space station, and the next day he had to dial it back because he was criticized by that. And I think the only countries that actually criticized India for this was Pakistan, and I think Germany put out something at a lesser level in the Conference of Disarmament. So, I mean, if you really want to have a stable, predictable domain, I think it's important to separate that from the geopolitical rivalry and have just a more objective list of responsible behavior. And again, this idea of doing a close approach and expelling things at high speed, I think everyone agrees that's probably not the best way to have a stable, predictable domain. Thank you.
Thanks, Victoria. Michael or Sarah, is there anything you'd like to sort of follow up on that point, whether it's specific to the Russian test or indeed responsible behavior? Yes, Michael, I see your hand, so please go ahead.
This is actually one of the reasons we focused on kinetic ASAT testing in the International Open Letter and didn't get into some of these murkier issues like proximity operations or jamming or cyber attacks on space infrastructure. Clearly, there's a spectrum of different actions that can be taken, either in testing or in actual anger. And we focused on the easiest in terms of getting some kind of diplomatic consensus on a ban. It helps in terms of getting a ban also that the major spacefaring powers don't need to engage in these ground-based kinetic tests anymore because they know they can do it, right? The United States, Russia, China, now India know they don't need to test a missile against a satellite because they've done it. They can also engage in flyby tests where they simply shoot the missile at a set of coordinates in space. So there doesn't actually have to be a satellite there to test their capability to target, or they can do computer simulations. And so the same kind of technological advantages that enabled us to agree on bans concerning nuclear weapons testing, right? You can simulate your nuclear weapons test with computers. You don't need to blow stuff up anymore. The same kind of technological advances in testing alternatives make this a relatively easy thing for these spacefaring powers to agree to. The concern is with regards to new entrants. So Pakistan may well wish to test in order to show India that it has this capability. There's Iran, there's North Korea. And the way that you stop these new entrants from engaging in these dangerous tests that create space debris is you create a global consensus that this kind of behavior is completely unacceptable. And that starts at the United Nations General Assembly. And it starts with the creation of knowledge and political will through efforts like our International Open Letter. So that's what it's about. I think everyone agrees we need to have much more international consensus, norms, lawmaking on the full spectrum of space security issues. This is the disarmament challenge of this century. The International Open Letter just focuses on the lowest hanging fruit.
Thanks, Michael, very much. Sarah, is there anything else you wanted to add to that? Okay, so I see you shaking your head. So instead, let me suggest we've got another question here from the audience. I don't have a name, but the question was perhaps deceptively straightforward, which is how are you defining high altitude? And I'm not sure if the question specifically relates to the testing altitude of a kinetic anti-satellite, or if we're talking about the altitude of the debris that is ejected from those kinds of tests. So maybe you could just give us just a further quick rundown on the kinds of altitudes that we're speaking of in this context. Thanks a lot.
Yeah, so I think kind of I'll just answer both since it wasn't such on the question. So high altitude when it comes to the actual test itself, it's kind of like a general rule of thumb that I've seen in a lot of reports where like things that take place below a few hundred kilometers, like a test takes place, is kind of a good altitude to minimize debris at. So like missile defense tests often take place at about 140 kilometers. The India ASAT test was, just under 300 kilometers. And those are useful to try and like minimize debris here. So we're talking about high altitudes when it comes to like tests. For example, like the 2007 test that took place at like 800 kilometers. That's, the kind of high altitude testing that I'm thinking of. When it comes to debris though, when I said high altitude, in the presentation I was doing, for example, I'm thinking about basically anything that is crossing all of those shells. So low Earth orbit's usually defined, up to about 2,000 kilometers. And so, things that are spanning up to, 1,000 or more kilometers is really getting up into high altitude regimes. But, anything above like 400 kilometers is really going to stay there for a while. You're going to have some long-lasting fragments, especially just basically a lot of that has to do with air drag or gas drag, I should say. So fragments above those altitudes, above 400, 500 kilometers, anything above that are going to take a while to come down because gas drag just isn't as effective. And it's kind of interesting, like the low Earth orbit versus above that in geo is a completely different regime because debris isn't as much of an issue there, but now you have other issues like micrometeoroid impacts and stuff like that as well that come into play. Yeah.
Thanks, Sarah. Yes, Michael, you wanted to jump in, so please go ahead.
It's not part of the International Open Letter, and we haven't published this work yet, but Sarah did actually do some modeling with regards to missile defense testing. And whether missile defense tests could create long-lasting debris. And the short, unofficial answer to the question I've just asked is if the energy is high enough resulting from the impact, then yes, absolutely, it can create space debris, regardless of the altitude of the actual impact. Now, some missile defense interceptors are larger than others and will therefore impart more energy. Some of them are going faster than others and will therefore impart more energy. And the targets that they are impacting with may be larger or smaller depending on the choice of the operators of the test. But is there an absence of space debris risk from a fast, large interceptor, let's say one of the ones based in Alaska with the United States, striking a ICBM that is used in a test, a large, fast incoming missile? Oh yeah, there's a space debris risk. Now it may be if the test is at a low altitude down in the 150 kilometer range, that the apogee, the lowest part of the resulting elliptical orbits will encounter a lot of air drag, but the perigee, the top end, might still be at 2,000 kilometers. And so in the time it takes for that piece of debris to slow down and re-enter at the low end, it may still be crossing the orbit of the International Space Station and other space objects multiple times. So everything is risky. It's significant that some of the signatories of our International Open Letter are retired astronauts. People like Chris Hadfield, Bob Thirsk, and that's because they internalize this issue, right? Victoria was talking about small pieces of debris. If you're out on a spacewalk repairing the ISS on the outside and you get hit by a piece of debris the size of a paint fleck, it will still go right through your suit and you will die, right? So, yes, maybe a big satellite isn't at risk from a paint fleck, but an astronaut is. And so all of this involves risk. And the thing is, it's all avoidable. We just shouldn't be doing these kinds of tests.
Thanks very much, Michael. I'm going to actually turn back to an audience question. This is one from one of our fabulous CGLG interns, Millie Sutton. Thanks, Millie, for the question. And this is, I think, really ties into a lot of what we've been speaking about, particularly in the last couple of rounds. And Millie asks, to me, space weapons and space debris seem like a collective action problem. Given the international community's response to other collective action problems like climate change and COVID-19, how realistic is it for the international community to act on space weapons, especially, and I think this is an interesting point, especially because it is such an abstract and literally off-world challenge. So maybe Victoria, I'll come to you first. I know Michael will have points on this, and Sarah, I think you probably do as well, but how do we imagine, we've been speaking quite a bit about the need for a response, and so how do we imagine the urgency and the likelihood of gaining some traction amidst a variety of different initiatives, of which the open letter is one?
Sure, there's a lot going on, no doubt. But I think, first of all, we're not talking about banning all space weapons. I want to make very clear in this matter. It's the idea you're not banning technologies, you're looking at behavior. And so I think that really shifts the focus because, to be honest, for the past couple decades, the UN has been stuck when talking about space security and stability at the multilateral level, because there's been a dispute between the major space powers should be focusing on technology or behavior. Russia, China, and their allies have been focused extremely, I would say almost exclusively, on the idea that the biggest threat to space security and stability is space-based interceptors placed in orbit, i.e. missile defense interceptors from an orbit, which no one is looking at, but they're still focused on that. Whereas the US and its allies have focused more on space as almost an environmental problem. It's congested, it's contested, it's competitive, that sort of thing. And so it's been really hard to have any kind of progress at the multilateral level because there's been a dispute. Should we focus on weapons that are designated officially to be weapons placed in orbit? And if so, should we have a treaty banning that or what have you? Whereas a lot of the technology, a lot of it's dual use. So it isn't so much the technology that's concerned, frankly. It's more what you do with it. And so I think with this movement towards the idea that you have to look at behavior, I think they're starting to be more and more interested in that. And part of that is because there's more countries investing in space, which means it's becoming more real to them. I always argue that everyone on this planet is a user of space data, whether or not you know it. But frankly, historically, a lot of countries looked at space security as something that affected the United States and Russia and maybe China. It was a superpower issue that they didn't really have any kind of vested interest in, which they absolutely do. So I think more countries are recognizing that it's relevant to their security and stability, the economic development, to the socioeconomic development. But they're also recognizing that, they have a role to play in this as well. And then finally pointing out, why now and why do we think it's going to change as opposed to inaction? Generally speaking, everyone agrees the creation of long-lived debris is a bad idea. I mentioned earlier the response to the UK resolution and the US Secretary of Defense memo. Those international responses and the US Secretary of Defense memo all identified the deliberate creation of long-lived debris is a bad idea. And so you have those disparate actors from all over the world are coming to an agreement on this. I think we're actually coming to a point where there's a common understanding that this is a bad idea and then this is not helpful and this affects everyone's ability to utilize space. Whereas for other efforts, climate change and COVID-19 and what have you, there's a bunch of different, I think, responses that are possible, and there's different interests and different end goals and that sort of thing. And I think for the space debris issue, in terms of deliberate creation of long-lived debris through anti-satellite tests, I think we're getting to the point where there's a common understanding that this is not helpful, not a good idea, particularly if you're investing more in your space capabilities, and particularly if you're trying to launch more satellites. I'll finally end by saying, it's not just the major space powers that are affected by this. Ecuador, almost a decade ago, they launched their first satellite. Within a month, it was taken out by a piece of debris. And so, this affects everyone. So it's definitely, and whereas I think maybe historically that had not been understood as much, more and more countries are recognizing that they have a role to play in space security and stability and that it's relevant to them. So I am cautiously optimistic that we can see some progress on this because we're stepping out of the binary treaty, no treaty conversation that the UN has been stuck in for decades now. We're focusing less on technology and more on behavior. And I think that's probably a healthier and more productive way of looking at things, at least I'm hoping.
Thanks, Victoria. Michael, you've spoken about this collective action problem in comments, I think, already today, but also in other writing and speaking that I've seen you do. Do you want to just follow up a little bit on anything that Victoria said in terms of how we imagine this issue? Maybe this is a bit of the subtext for Millie's question in the context of so many other big problems, how we generate momentum and interest and commitment on the topic as well.
Well, I would argue that that we can get to meaningful cooperation in space more easily than in most other issue areas because we have a long track record of cooperation in space. I've already mentioned the Limited Test Ban Treaty, 1963, height of the Cold War. It was the Apollo-Soyuz project, the famous handshake in space between NASA astronauts and Soviet cosmonauts in the mid-1970s. Not many people know, but in 1979, the Soviet Union and the United States came to a preliminary agreement to ban kinetic ASAT testing. The only reason that didn't become a treaty was because early the next year, the Soviet Union invaded Afghanistan, and we had the boycott of the Moscow Olympics, and everything fell apart. But we were close in 1979 already. The International Space Station is literally a shining example of international cooperation. And before someone says that we don't cooperate with China in space, I would simply point them to the Disasters Charter or the COSPAS-SARSAT agreement. There are lots of areas in space that we cooperate very closely with China also. So it's a region in which we have a history and a practice of cooperation. We can do this. The other thing in terms of the collective action problem, and I've already mentioned it, is that modern militaries have an intense interest in maintaining safe access to low Earth orbit because all of their satellites are located there. Their eyes and ears are in space. So the same thing that makes satellites attractive military targets, the fact that they're the eyes and ears of militaries, is what gives all states a strong interest in avoiding runaway space debris. The Kessler syndrome, the kind of thing that could well arise in a mega constellation environment if someone were to engage in another kinetic ASAT test. So I'm actually very optimistic here. And if we don't try, of course, we don't know whether we can succeed.
Michael, it's a bit spooky. It's almost as if you're reading my mind right now, because I wanted to go to Sarah with the same question, but with a variation, because we have another question that's come in from Fiona asking about the Kessler syndrome and whether or not that's actually as big a concern, or whether it's perhaps in some respects a distraction relative to the other risks that might exist. So the question sort of goes as follows: that the Kessler syndrome is frequently used to raise public concerns regarding space debris, though there are many genuine, less sensationalist type concerns, or perhaps more nuanced cases. Is the Kessler syndrome, or indeed, and this is interesting, I think, the reference to the film Gravity, which I think something that many people will be familiar with and did generate a lot of discussion about space debris. Is that narrative justified, or is it counterproductive? Sarah, what do you, from your perspective, what do you think about that?
Yeah, I would say that the reason that it's a really helpful point to put across to the public to get them interested is because basically, no matter like whether or not you have tests happening like this or not, you're still having debris generated from lots of other factors. And so I think that especially with having like mega constellations, things like that are just increasing by just multiple orders of magnitude how much infrastructure is just in space, like it becomes a real possibility. It's kind of, it's a good alarm bell, I think, which is why it's like a valid point to bring up. Because you also have, other things contributing to the orbital debris environment regardless. So you could, have a successful test ban treaty which comes forth, and then no more testing is happening, and you can have people trying to mitigate debris as much as possible in other ways, but you still have, like one of the biggest contributors to orbital debris is just like fragmenting of satellites, defunct satellites in orbit from other things like old batteries and leftover fuel exploding. You have like meteoroid impacts, you have just from the wear and tear of like the harsh environment of space, shedding off pieces of paint from satellites, stuff like that. And so you have orbital debris being created all the time, regardless of if you have tests or something like that occurring. And so something like the Kessler syndrome starts to become a really real possibility, especially when you have just like an exponential increase in how much infrastructure is up in space, especially with like mega constellations and stuff. And I think that's, it's really helpful then to kind of create a public and global like motivation for a ban like this, because it's not only in the interest of space security from like a military or government perspective, but also just in like the private sector and industry now, because everyone's going to be affected and everyone's going to start to become very reliant on space. And I think it's become a lot more clear from things like Starlink and stuff like that happening, where space starts to feel a lot more relevant to everybody. So yeah, that's what I have to say about that. Pass it back to you.
Thanks very much. Victoria, I think you wanted to jump in. So following on from Sarah, Victoria, why don't you go ahead?
No, I think Sarah brought up some excellent points about the importance of illustrating the concern. I mean, let's be honest, if nothing else, the past year and a half has taught us we're not a science literate society at all. And so if there's ways in which to help demonstrate these issues, I think it's helpful. Now, I know I'm coming at it from the point of view of a political scientist, and my actual, space scientist friends get very upset about, the lack of technical accuracy for these sort of things. In fact, I think my organization had an event shortly after Gravity came out talking about the legal and technical issues that were brought up by the concerns that were brought up by that. But, I mean, the other example that I often give is the movie WALL-E, which, if you've ever watched it, there's the idea that the Earth is not only trashed from humanity on the ground level, but there's just like a layer of trash you have to pop through in order to leave the planet. And so I mean, realistically speaking, we're talking about debris. We're not talking to that extent, but it's more the matter of it's going to become too risky from an economic or a technical risk point to be able to use certain spheres. Michael brought up the idea of the mega constellations. I mean, right now we have about 4,800 active satellites. And then so you're thinking about if you have another 100,000 possibly, which may not happen, but in theory that could be that. I mean, that's going to be a danger and then you add in the debris that's created from normal satellite usage. I mean, it's going to be a real consideration. And so, in my opinion, I think it's helpful just to have a shorthand, for people to use. And if that's helpful, they'll be doing that. I will say as well, there are Russians on the space station right now filming a movie, and as far as I know, the plot of the movie is that one of the astronauts is on a spacewalk, one of the cosmonauts is on a spacewalk, and gets hit by a piece of debris. So I have a feeling we're going to be having this conversation over and over again. But in the meantime, anything that helps visualize this so the public understands why it's crucial, and perhaps more importantly, why policymakers need to put money towards solving these issues, in my opinion, is not a bad thing. Thank you.
Michael, I see you want to jump in as well, so please go ahead.
Two quick points. First of all, the CEOs of both Iridium and Planet signed the International Open Letter, which showed great leadership from the two of them with regards to this issue. And Aaron Boley and I spoke to the leadership of a lot of other major satellite companies in this effort to recruit signatories, and every single one of them accepted that this was a crisis situation, and that the International Open Letter was well timed and making a very important point. Some of them signed for other reasons, but there was no question that this was important. And again, the leaders of two companies that have well-established, not that large, but well-established constellations put their names to paper here. The other thing very quickly is that we can draw analogies between what we know about climate change and what we know about space debris. The Kessler syndrome is a feedback loop, right? So it's similar to melting the Arctic sea ice and reducing the albedo of the northern part of the planet, replacing white ice with dark blue water that absorbs a lot of solar energy that then creates more warming, or the melting of the permafrost, which releases methane and therefore increases more warming. We're accustomed to this literature of feedback loops when we're talking about other environmental issues. So there's nothing dramatically new about this. The Kessler syndrome is simply getting to a tipping point as a result of creating feedback loops, whether it's with regards to exploding rocket bodies in low Earth orbit, or defunct satellites that don't function when they arrive in orbit, so-called bricks, or whether it's some country deciding to test a kinetic anti-satellite weapon. There are all kinds of contributing factors, but at some point you get to an overload, you get to a tipping point, and then it's gone. And this is why I am so excited about the fact that many of the people who are signing the International Open Letter now are young people, right? They're students, they're space enthusiasts, they're people who not only are engaged with these issues, but see this as a planetary survival sustainability issue, that this is their future that we're talking about, just as when we're talking about the atmosphere or talking about the oceans. So everyone who's watching this, it's the young people's signatures who matter most, not the former prime minister or the retired astronauts or the Nobel laureates, because the young people are the ones who have the greatest stake in this, and they, of course, will be leading delegations to the United Nations General Assembly in just a decade or two.
Thanks, Michael, very much. I've got a couple more questions in my queue, and I'm just going to say quickly to Matthew out there, who you know who you are. I'm going to get to your question if I've got time, but I've got one just ahead because it's really connected directly to what we've just been speaking about. So Matthew, hang tight, but it's a great question, and I'll try to work it in. This is from Mauricio, another one of our students. And this, I think, is another really interesting one that maybe doesn't exactly temper the optimism, but just sort of asks how we go about getting better consensus, or at least some sort of momentum and agreement. And the question goes as follows: would you attribute some of the disagreements about what to do about space debris and space weapons to just how decentralized space is within international institutions? So would there be more progress in multilateral action if there was something more like a centralized intergovernmental body with one secretariat, as opposed to the kind of alphabet soup? I'm not even going to read them all out because there are many that tend to be more specialist in different areas, handling specific aspects of space and space governance technically and otherwise. So would trying to bring these different competencies under one body help, in your view, in terms of the prospect of getting better progress? Michael, I see you're shaking your head, so I'm going to let you go first, but please, Victoria and Sarah, do jump in afterwards.
I like having options when it comes to making progress diplomatically and in terms of international law. And so having multiple different organs of the United Nations, or indeed institutions outside of the United Nations available and working on these things is a good thing. So let's start off with COPUOS, the United Nations Committee on the Peaceful Uses of Outer Space. Created in 1958, still relatively high functioning today, actually coming to agreement, producing guidelines, dealing with the civilian side of space, but doing so in a very meaningful way, in a process that because it involves consensus, it takes time, but it still happens. The Conference on Disarmament, not so much. It's been gummed up for a couple of decades now, but has done important things in the past and may well do important things in the future. And full credit to the British diplomats leading on their initiative in the United Nations. They've gone to the United Nations General Assembly. And the General Assembly, which does not operate on the basis of consensus, will, I think, in all likelihood, create an open-ended working group, and we'll see some progress taking place there. No, I don't see the idea of centralization as necessary or indeed a good thing. And then, of course, as Adam well knows, you can break out of the established international organizations at any time and do an ad hoc negotiation, as was done for the Landmines Convention and then for the Cluster Mines Convention. So different horses for different courses. What is the issue and how do you get across the finish line? That's what matters.
Sarah, I see your hand up, so why don't you go ahead, and then Victoria, you can jump in after that. I'll come to you third.
Yeah, I just had a really small kind of related thought when Michael was talking about like COPUOS, so Canadian the Peaceful Use of Outer Space, and like this is kind of a related thing, not necessarily multilateralism, but I remember like hearing about how, so like within that committee, there's a scientific and technical subcommittee, and then there's the legal subcommittee. And I feel like one important thing when it comes to like space debris and these sorts of things is the merging of like the legal side with the scientific side, because for a really long time in like that case, those two subcommittees operate separately. And even though there's a basis of consensus, like, you know, there isn't as much communication as like, in my opinion, there should be between the two sides. I think like now, with the way that the space industry is going and stuff, like the merging of those two sides is becoming more important than ever. So like that's the thing that I think is really important to highlight is like those sorts of intercommunications to make progress. So that's just a quick thought I had, but I can pass it over to Victoria.
So anyways, going into the question about this, I mean, should you have, a consolidated authority? Actually, my organization put together recommendations for the new Biden administration when they came on board this past winter. And one of the things we said is, the United States should have someone in charge of space environmental management. Like someone should be in charge of all this to really have a holistic idea. Because right now for the United States, if you want to launch a satellite, you have to get the FAA to approve your launch license. You need, because the FAA is in charge of things going up and coming back down, but not while they're in orbit. If you want to broadcast, you have to get something from the FCC to get your broadcasting license. As part of that, you need to show end of life sort of rules or ideas. You're not just leave your satellite up there at the end. You have some way of following guidelines for getting rid of your satellite at the end. And then you have to, and if you're going to do any kind of visual of the planet at all, you need a remote sensing license from NOAA. But there's no one, but it's very stovepiped, and there's no one really in charge of like the holistically, how do you deal with debris? Like no one's in charge of active debris removal for the United States, which is crazy. It's something you think maybe NASA would be looking into, or the DoD. No one's in charge of it. And so I think we argue it would be helpful at the national level to have someone in charge of space environmental management. Having said that, I mean, I agree with Michael. At the international level, this is a feature, not a bug, that you have the multiple different organizations, the multiple viewpoints. I mean, the reason why you have COPUOS in charge of civil space and the CD or First Committee in charge of security space is that those engender very different responses, shall we say. COPUOS is very able to talk about they call it space flight safety, the idea of safe operations. Whereas if you're talking security space, then that opens the idea of weapons and security, and that's kind of a third rail sort of discussion. He brought up the idea of the long-term sustainability guidelines from COPUOS. My organization is very biased because our executive director, Peter Martinez, was the working group chair of that. But we liked it before he was our executive director. But be that as it may, I mean, that took the better part of a decade to negotiate 21 guidelines and a preamble. But that's a feature, that's the idea. If you're going to build international consensus, oftentimes it's going brick by brick. The point I always make is those 21 long-term sustainability guidelines. Yeah, they're not earth-shaking. They're very much kind of a low-hanging fruit, sort of the really commonly agreed upon best practices. But COPUOS is a consensus organization, which meant all, I think at that point, 92 countries that were in it. And these are countries as disparate as the United States, Russia, China, Iran. All those countries had to do 100% agreement on those guidelines, which is a good thing. I think it can be beneficial. So I think there are different approaches for these sort of things, and it's not a bad idea necessarily to have different ways in which you're doing about it. And the other point I'll end with is that a lot of countries don't have the money, frankly, to send people to multiple different international organizational meetings. They have money for the United Nations, and that's it. And there are people for that. And so if you move stuff outside the United Nations, you are basically cutting off a good chunk of the globe from being participating in these conversations. Having said that, countries are not anxious to give any more money to the nations. So when we're looking at these kind of responses, this came up a lot in the COPUOS discussions, there cannot be anything, and I forget the exact phrasing, but cause a monetary cost. It's like working with what we have already, because frankly, it's strapped, and we don't want to divert the funds from where they're already being used. So it's always a consideration when international organizations and their diplomats are discussing these sort of issues. Thank you.
Thanks, Victoria. And we're coming close to the end of our time, so I'm very sorry for those questions that were posted, and I have a few, but we won't get a chance to get to them now. What I want to do is just give everyone a last sort of quick fire opportunity, maybe just to suggest what we should be looking for as next steps in these discussions, because we've had a really rich and fruitful conversation, both about the open letter and its context and its motivation, but how it relates to a variety of other initiatives. Maybe I'll just go around quickly. Sarah, if you don't mind, I'll start with you. Thinking about this sort of, what would we want to know maybe? Is it a matter of getting better data from some, Victoria mentioned, for example, space surveillance? Is it integrating that data in different ways? What would we be looking for, just sort of as a last thought of how we can improve and work towards some of the goals that have been outlined over the last hour and a half?
Yeah, for sure. I think there's kind of the two segments between it. Can you hear me now? Okay, sorry, it took a second to unmute. There's kind of the two sides to it. So one is in the actual data for ASAT testing itself. So there isn't it gets very complicated looking at how, for example, in the physics perspective, energy is put into the system. So when you have, a collision, you know how fast it's going, you know what the masses are. But there's kind of this coupling between mass and energy. We don't know exactly how much, energy is put in and momentum in like what way. And so modeling the ejected fragments can be very non-trivial to get very tricky. So having, improved modeling on that and just, more research into that is one thing. When it comes to actually debris characterization and tracking, about less than like 1% of a lot of the debris up there is like well tracked and cataloged and everything, because so much of it is too small to see, or smaller fragments have very unstable orbits that are very unpredictable. So I think having a lot of surveillance right now is ground-based. So having space-based surveillance would be a huge thing. Watching how fragments evolve over time, being able to monitor in situ on spacecraft to see the small collisions that happen with like really small scale debris, stuff like that, can be very helpful to kind of just keep better track of the current orbital environment over time. So thanks.
Thanks, Sarah. Maybe Victoria and Michael, if I could ask you each just to be really, really quick, sort of 30 seconds as a last thought, because we'll be cut off at the end of the hour and I need to say thank you. So Victoria, why don't I come to you and then quickly to Michael and then we'll wrap up.
Yes, can you guys hear me? All right, great. Really quickly, I think the idea of getting more information about what's happening on orbit through increased transparency, whether it's governmental space mission awareness or commercial SSA, is important. But I also want to argue that things like this letter are very crucial, because what we're doing has not worked at the international level. We've been stuck. And so something like this, focusing on responsible behavior, is a way in which we can get unstuck and make sure that space is predictable and stable and usable for all over the long term. Thank you.
Okay, and last from me, please just go to the Outer Space Institute website and read the International Open Letter, and then click on the sign here icon and sign the letter, and then share it with your colleagues and friends. But the most important thing is spend some time with the plot that Sarah worked on to understand the problem from a scientific perspective, because that's what drives the need for collective decision making at the international level. We are in a crisis situation. We have a solution. We have a diplomatic process is underway at the United Nations General Assembly right now, but it's all based upon that plot. So please look at that, and then please sign the letter and share it with as many people as you can. Thank you.
Well, on that note, it's my honor to thank Michael, Victoria, and Sarah for a fascinating discussion. Thank our audience for attending, for your questions, and thank IT Services, Colin Reed, who is producing this event and done a masterful job, and our School of IR Research and Events Administrator, Jenny Halley, who is basically the one who solves all of our problems. So thanks to you all. Have a good rest of your evening or day, and we look forward to carrying on the conversation soon. Thank you. Bye-bye.